On the 3rd of December 2019 and the 11th of February 2020, I submitted motions for the production of documents relating to PFAS safety testing on civilians surrounding military bases at Richmond and Williamtown. On both occasions, I received letters from the Minister for Defence advising that the Department of Defence and the Department of Health did not retain the results of that safety testing as it was personal information relevant to the persons only. At the meeting on Monday, it now appears that summary data was indeed provided to the Department and would be made available. In the time since our meeting, has that data been confirmed and will it be forthcoming?
Senator Chris Spira, First Assistant Secretary, Infrastructure in the Department of Defence. Senator, you'll recall that during that briefing on Monday, it was the PFAS task force in the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment that undertook to check with that. As we stated at that time to you, Senator, we don't have access to any of the test information, test data or results. The results from the voluntary blood testing program are provided back to the members of the community who have undertaken that and participated in the voluntary blood testing program, and where they've agreed, the results were shared with the ANU School of Epidemiology as part of the Department of Health's contracted epidemiological study into PFAS.
The summary data, though, was going to be shared with us.
Yeah, and the PFAS task force was going to check with that, Senator, if you recall from the meeting on Monday.
Thank you. Second question is that the ANU is running an epidemiological study at contaminated sites. Which department is that on behalf of?
Senator, the Commonwealth Department of Health contracted the ANU School of Epidemiology to undertake the epidemiological study.
Is it possible to please obtain the preliminary report, or failing that, when will we have the results of the study?
So, Senator, the ANU School of Epidemiology gave evidence towards the PFAS subcommittee of the Joint Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade I think it was in late November of last year. They've also published a number of reports, and on the ANU website there's information including a literature review, but they're working to the Department of Health and any detailed questions beyond what the ANU has already made public is best addressed towards the Department of Health.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Berry.
Senator Roberts, I understand that at that briefing we also did undertake to come back to you by the 23rd of March with further information.
Correct.
And that still stands. Okay,
thank you. Third question is, how is the ANU study methodology different to the world's largest epidemiological study resulting from the Parkersburg-Billot lawsuit, which found a probable link to kidney cancer, testicular cancer, thyroid disease, high cholesterol, preeclampsia and ulcerative colitis with a sufficient degree of certainty to cause DuPont to settle for $671 million?
Senator,
is the ANU study testing 65,000 people?
Senator, for the methodology of the epidemiological study, those questions are best directed to either the Department of Health or the Australian National University.
Thank you. The federal government released your response to the Senate inquiry into the management of PFAS contamination last Friday. Your response refuses to accept the recommendations of your own committee that a PFAS commissioner be appointed to manage compensation, because you also refuse to accept the recommendation to compensate, remediate and relocate like for like. When are you going to get these people out of their contamination zones?
Senator, that was a whole of government response. The Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment led the development of that response on behalf of the government. So questions on the response to the Joint Standing Committee Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade report is best directed towards the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment.
Thank you. I was kindly offered the minutes of the last 3 meetings of the Interdepartmental Committee on PFAS submitted within the next sitting week. Can I confirm those will be forthcoming in full?
Senator, you asked the officials, our colleagues from the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment, for the minutes of those meetings. That interdepartmental committee is led or convened by the PFAS task force in the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment, and so they undertook to provide that. And as Minister Reynolds stated, we undertook to provide that information and our colleagues from the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment by the 23rd of March.
Thank you. We discussed the issue of contaminated cattle being moved into clean areas and whether the PFAS contamination level dropped by way of dilution owing to cattle growth or by loss to the system through excretion. I've since found data referenced in the DuPont press release that supports your position. One study used a sample of just 6 cows fed PFAS at unspecified levels for just 28 days. And another study was for 4 cows fed PFAS at unspecified levels for 28 days. This should have been done with specified levels of PFAS and should have been done over a prolonged period so that we get into generational transfer and see what happens over multi-generations. Is the department or the task force relying upon this kind of junk science from DuPont in any way to support its position?
Senator, questions regarding animal health should be addressed towards the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. Questions relating to human health, including food safety, should be addressed towards predominantly the Department of Health.
Thank you. Can I confirm that the class action lawsuit settled last week was settled as to the loss of enjoyment of property, loss of real estate value, and nuisance caused by the contamination, and did not go to health outcomes?
Yes.
And I've noticed that in recent months, DuPont shares have fallen 60%. Number 8, I was advised that Defence is discussing suing DuPont and other manufacturers for the damage they have caused. That's the damage that DuPont has caused. New Hampshire, the states of New Hampshire and Michigan in the United States have filed such complaint. Will the department take the matter of a lawsuit seriously in order to recover the money you should be paying to residents in contaminated zones?
Senator, your characterisation of what we said doesn't quite align with my recollection.
I'd love to hear your recollection.
Well, what we stated, Senator, then is that we're considering options and gathering information on it, but we're currently working through the current, in principle agreement to the settlement of the class action.
As I recall it, it was quite clear that one of the considerations, one of the options is to sue the manufacturers DuPont.
We're looking at our options on that, Senator.
Thank you. We were advised that it was not feasible to remediate outside of defence bases owing to the high cost and low PFAS yield. On the basis of what cost-benefit analysis was this decision taken?
Senator, I don't accept your characterisation about it's not feasible or because of cost. It's accepted practice in terms of addressing contaminated land that you address the key source areas. That's because where there's the opportunity to remove the most mass of the contamination before it migrates off the base. It is at much higher levels there, and so the way to reduce the amounts of contamination within the overall plume over time is best addressed through addressing those key source areas and migration pathways, and that's what we're doing at Williamstown.
Yeah, I must admit that that was a blanket statement I just made, and you're correct. You did say that you were remediating the base, but my comments were going more towards Fullerton Cove and the Hunter and the people of Newcastle.
Yeah, and what we described then, Senator, was that there's key source areas on the base, and we're addressing those through treating the groundwater and also undertaking soil excavation at some of those key source areas. In terms of the contamination spreading to the south of the base, another consideration is surface water, which is picking up PFAS from those source areas on the base and moving through drains, particularly Dawson's drain moving to the south and then Moore's drain immediately to the east and then further on. And we are undertaking treatment of a large volume of water that's leaving the base through those drains to reduce the surface water flows.
Right, thank you for clarifying that. But my original comment about the lack of treatment of the area around Fullerton Cove is correct. But I understand and I will acknowledge that you're focusing on the high priority items first. I'll acknowledge that.
As part of that too, Senator, I should add that we're currently putting in place measures in order to address the highest groundwater plume to the immediate south of the base, in what's called the primary management zone, including potentially off base and bringing water back to the base to treat from that. But again, that's addressing a plume that commences at the base, moving to the immediate south, rather than those further areas onto Fullerton Cove that you mentioned.
Have you done any cost-benefit analysis of the various treatments? The off-base, well off-base?
It's not a cost-benefit analysis, Senator. What it is, it's looking at the complex hydrogeology of the site. It's working with our environmental consultants to understand the nature and extent of contamination and the migration pathways from those key source areas on the base into the community, and then what technologies and methodologies are available to best either address the source areas or to intercept that migration. So it's really about what is best practice in addressing contaminated lands.
So really, and this is not undermining what you're saying, it's just clarifying it.
Yep.
You're not at the stage of doing a cost-benefit analysis because you're still collecting the data on the complexities of the underground water movement.
Well, that's not our approach, Senator. It's not about cost-benefit analysis. It's about understanding the science behind the contamination and its movement off the base from the source areas, and where best to remove the mass of PFAS that we can from the environment. Our objective is to find the right methods to either remove the source areas or intercept migration so that we can remove the greatest mass of PFAS from the environment before it gets into the community.
Right, so there will still be implicit in that, surely there is a cost-benefit analysis, whether it be a financial cost or a human cost or an environmental cost.
Well, what it is that it's not effective seeking to chase every last molecule of the chemical that's already left those key source areas and migration pathways.
So, as I see it then, either individual humans and families are going to pay for the cost of this over the last few decades, or we can get DuPont to pay for it.
Well, what we're doing also is that the environmental investigations look at those key migration pathways. They also look at potential human health exposure pathways. And so breaking those potential human health exposure pathways to the local community was our initial focus. They included connecting people who had previously drunk groundwater that might have been contaminated with PFAS, which we know is the main way in which people are exposed to PFAS, to Hunter Water Corporation's reticulated water network, and so breaking or avoiding that key exposure pathway. So it's about addressing, we're taking steps to address those potential human health exposure pathways in addition to the migration pathways of the PFAS moving from the base into the community.
And I will acknowledge that the work the Defence Department has done in the water at Oakey and in other areas, our concerns though move beyond that now to people who need remediation, whether it's like not remediation in terms of PFAS, but in terms of they've had their livelihoods, their lives disrupted, turned upside down, and they need to have like-for-like treatment so that they get back to what they originally bought, well after the Department of Defence knew about this issue.
All right, that's good editorialising.